Let's talk challenges as a creator. You're living it, you're breathing it. Does anybody want to start the ball rolling, which will help us start exploring that? Michael.
I would just say, without the CRTC content regulations, stipulating that networks provide Canadian content, there would be none. I'm confident in saying that. If they announced tomorrow no more Canadian content necessary, the new fall schedule would have no Canadian content on it whatsoever. There might be some news and some hockey, but otherwise there would be no drama, I don't think. So now that we have this parallel system with unregulated new media, yeah, I don't have the answers, but I just know unless we do something, as has already been done in over-the-air TV business, I think that we are going to be fighting a flood of American content. I'm speaking selfishly because I'd like to keep working in the business that I'm in, but so I guess I'm speaking out of self-preservation, I suppose. But I just want to say thanks for the regulations that exist. I wish there was, they actually had higher sort of levels of Canadian content, but without it, I think we'd be in trouble.
Thanks, Michael. So you're referring to the new world and what is yet to be determined in terms of
the existing world that we already work in, and how we fight even now to get our stuff on the air as is. So again, I don't have answers about how to regulate it. Some suggestions about how possibly to regulate new media, all the new stuff coming at us. But I'm just saying, from my experience, as you say, if we didn't have regulations in place stipulating that we have a place to put our drama, there wouldn't be any Canadian drama. We'd be watching American television. Our children would grow up with American television. So I think it's just if you want a lesson learned from the people already in this room already, I think that would be the big one, at least from my point of view.
Okay, great. Does anybody want to pick up on that? Yes, Dave?
Just a sort of a different point of view. I come from the factual entertainment area, and we're a very small company. We only produce probably 30 hours of television a year, but I feel that there's a strong market for it internationally. I know that the CRTC regulations give us a leg up, but if they were to disappear tomorrow, I'm not sure that we would be in as dire a situation as those who create drama would be. Because I think that in factual entertainment, Canadians compete just fine with, with American television. And I think it's because even American factual programming is made by companies about our size by and large, and there's nothing so great that they're doing with all kinds of money that really we can't do.
So there's a difference between the factual opportunities versus the drama?
That's my perception.
Right, okay. Andrew?
Andrew, yeah, and I'm right in the middle, and it's also a completely different thing again, because I work in animation, and we are currently working on animated shows for American clients, as well as Canadian content that we're putting on Canadian channels. And so we actually do both worlds at the same time. And when it goes to the States, we can certainly compete on quality and whatnot, but if they don't need creative people from Canada, they don't use creative people from Canada. They'll use our technicians, they'll use our animators, they'll use the people that, we can compete with other countries on that level playing field. But when it comes to the writers, if it's an American show, they only hire out of Hollywood. They send us scripts. They do not, as a Canadian writer, even working in the company, I can't get my foot in the door of the American co-production, because it's just, no, we have best writers in the world. We don't need you. So yes, I still think the animation studio would exist. Would it exist where we have all key creative people there? No, I don't think it would without regulations. I think they're very important in keeping the high-level jobs, certainly in my little genre there. But I think they're all very different, and that's a big problem for this room to come to
drama's more
consensus.
expensive, so.
Yeah.
And networks don't want to pay that premium dollar if they can fill their airtime with product that's equally valid, tells interesting stories, but costs a lot less. That's what they'll do.
So in terms of what's on television, our Canadian television system, I mean, the benefits are what you're describing, is that there's opportunities for Canadians to contribute to that content. The danger is that if that didn't exist, potentially those opportunities would not exist as well.
Yeah.
David.
Gord, just as I think almost an example of that, great example whereby on Family Channel, which is largely Disney content coming into Canada, the #1 show on there is a Canadian show, The Next Step, made by Temple Street Productions. That wouldn't have the opportunity to reach the air and reach that level of success amongst all those Disney shows if not for the CRTC framework there. And yet, once it's there, it's able to compete no problem with the best in the world.
Okay. So we can deliver, but it provides the framework in which we can have that opportunity to deliver. Wayne.
Well, I'd say that we can service, and that's been an ongoing debate, not a debate, it's an ongoing fact for 30 years in the film and television production. There have been the indigenous productions, and then there are the service productions. The service productions provide tons of jobs in Vancouver and Toronto, even in Halifax, Montreal, for the technical side, for, you know, technicians, makeup artists, so on and so forth. If you want to do indigenous production, if you want to tell Canadian stories without some sort of CRTC network structure that says, no, we have to have room to tell Canadian stories to each other, I think we'd be in trouble. It's just been that way for 30 years. I don't see it changing much over the next 30, even if you factor in internet and any other system that pops up overnight. It's still going to come down to the only reason for the CRTC to exist, the only reason for Canadian broadcasters to exist, is to make sure that Canadians have a place on the airwaves or the cable systems of this country. Otherwise, let's toss out the CRTC and let the FCC take care of stuff. Why do we need Canadian broadcasters if they're just going to pipe primetime America into us? I don't need to see Canadian commercials. I'm quite happy to watch Buffalo commercials or Boston commercials. Doesn't matter to me. You know, in fact, there's a whole structure here that exists that people are making a lot of money out of. I mean, if Rogers can afford to spend $5.2 billion on hockey, somebody's making some change. And it comes from Canadians, and I think Canadians have a right to see themselves on their own airwaves. We're not the only country that fights this battle. I mean, you can go to any other country outside of North America, and we could have exactly the same debate. So I don't think we need to apologize for demands that we may have to be able to see ourselves on television, be it in a reality show, be it in a factual entertainment show, be it in a documentary, be it in a low-budget comedy or a big-budget drama. It's, you know, we have a right to see ourselves on television or on media generally.
Thank you. I mean, I would, to summarize, I think we've covered at this point, for the most part, what's working. Or for the most part, what's working. It's the current system which allows for the opportunities for creators to create Canadian content, which gets on Canadian television, which is viewed by consumers. So the opportunity. What today isn't working? Does anybody have any comments on that?
Well, one thing I see about to fall apart, and I mean, I think this is obvious to everybody because we're currently working on, you know, I'm writing for a show that's on Canadian television, and I'm working on a show that's going to Amazon.com. They're both shows, linear broadcast shows, but the broadcaster over here is paying his fair share to support the Canadian content. Amazon is not, and therefore I see these people standing up and yelling, why are we paying for all this when all these shows are going on the internet? So I think a redefinition of a broadcaster is necessary. We need to, and maybe you've got the definition, I don't know what it is, but you know, is Amazon.com a broadcaster? I don't know. They were selling me books up until someone walked in and said, you're working for Amazon. I'm like, what am I selling books? No, you're making a cartoon. Okay.
Sold me a rowing machine.
That's right. Well, that's what they're paying us in. I'm going to be super fit. No, but the traditional, we have this, what we've established possibly is working fairly well system, but it's only over here, and now the broadcasters are they're this giant circle, which creates the opportunity. But if these guys get a free ride off these folks, they're going to start, and rather than destroy the whole thing, am I making sense? I don't know.
Well,
Yes.
go ahead.
I would also like to mention that the regulations do help, and primarily, if we would take a look back into the broadcast acts that were introduced primarily in the 1930s, and even up to having revised versions in the late 1960s, they did help to contribute in a way to identify the Canadian values. So I think the question is whether or not, what are we looking at in today? Are we looking into an economical prosperity, or are we looking into defining the values that we as Canadians would want to project? And that's a really hard question. I mean,
It doesn't need to be an either or, though. You know, ideally, it would be both together.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think his point is well taken, that it's becoming more
The
and more.
approach is different.
Oh, absolutely.
It's becoming more and more an economic discussion. It's, you know, can we afford Canadian broadcasting? Can we afford this? Can we afford that? And really, I'd like to go back to some of the thinking of the 30s and 40s and 50s, where it said, but what is it that we want to do with this amazing machine in front of us, this whole broadcast, some system of diffusion, whether you call it broadcasting, internet, or whatever. You know, what's a good, smart use of all this technology and ability, as opposed to uniquely, how do we make a buck on it? I mean, the whole discussion seems to be more and more about monetizing, and less about what is culture.
I think we have a few hands, so that's great. Andrew, to your point, interesting question. Do we redefine, or are broadcasters being redefined? That's kind of an interesting question that maybe we can loop back to. I saw your hand, Michael.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of talk about a golden age of television, especially in America. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of that because, you know, Vanilla Ice goes Amish. I'm not sure how golden that is, but at least there's room in the market for, and in the stratosphere of channels for many different visions and voices, which is awesome. But no one's talking about a Canadian golden age of television. More than ever, some of the best writers in the world are going into television, and the standards of writing and TV have never been higher. I'm not sure why a parallel environment hasn't been created in Canada yet, but having come from the TV world in the early 2000s, there was a pressure, not on Wayne's show, by the way, there was and on Robson Arms, I directed for that, two shows that really were different. The other shows I worked on, there was this pressure to homogenize the show and make it more American. And I think it's really key that whatever golden age we might want to effect is that we don't lose sight of our own individual awesomeness, that we can compete. Our music industry competes. Our TV can compete. Our feature films can compete. That's a whole other story, but so the CRTC, I think, you know, has a role to play in moving us toward that golden age that can be like the Americans, only, you know, better, I think.
Thank you. Richard, you had.
We're talking about broadcasters, but I think we're actually now in an era of content distribution, right? So the whole term broadcaster seems to be sort of archaic, and we get tied up with that. And there are many different streams, which is a lot of different opportunities. But we can't leave it to somebody else to tell Canadian stories. I mean, they have to be told by Canadian writers, being directed by Canadian directors, and being performed by Canadian actors. No one else is going to make a miniseries like Trudeau or Canada-Russia. You know, nobody else is going to make a program like The Phantoms has just been up for an international Emmy, right? And we have to have that first place on Canadian television and on through the internet too, to make that viable. And we've seen policy before from the CRTC, primarily in 1999, when they loosened regulations. And we saw drama go from, I think, 12 hours a week in prime time to 2. So those stories weren't being told anymore. And great shows like The Associates suddenly disappeared off the airways. Things have improved in 2010 when there was an amount of money that had to be spent by the broadcasters, which meant there was more money to spend on drama. But unless I think history shows that unless people who are licensed are required to show Canadian content, they simply won't, because the economics are that it's cheaper to get it from next door, right? And I think sometimes Canadians aren't fully aware because of how important our stories being shared are to national identity, right? To who we are as a people in this huge land. And it's vital that we see more of those stories, and obviously, I mean drama, on our screens, whatever screens they are. Yeah.
Thanks. Andrew?
Well, Michael and I were talking about a point. We were at the, speaking with the CMF a few weeks back, and one of their issues was there's an underutilized development fund. And what the conversation that struck us was this development fund has to be triggered by a broadcaster. The broadcaster chooses its shows based on economic models and what they hope is going to sell and how they can be a successful broadcaster. We as creators want to create things because we think they're funny, they're good, they're a Canadian story, there's something we want to tell. I don't have to write a Canadian story, I'm a Canadian. Every time I write it, it is a Canadian story. There seems in the current system, like every show I develop on my own dollar. I do it out of my own pocket. I hire animators to do it, and it goes. There doesn't seem to be, there's such a disconnect between the creator and the ability to create, and then once the show gets going, we don't have this system with the showrunner where if the head writer on a show is Canadian, the stories will be Canadian. And if we get more to that model where the actual creators are driving the show, I mean, I can compete with America in quality and money because we do. They come up here and hire us. So all we need to do is be at the table when the stories are being written, and then they automatically become Canadians. So we seem to be in a system where the broadcaster is the one that says, okay, we'll listen to you for a few minutes, not the other way around, where the creators are bringing that new and original voice to the forefront.
And was that the case 10 years ago? 15 years ago?
Don't go much further, I'm not that old.
All right. You're right.
Was that the case? I'm not sure. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know. I mean, some
I'm
people-
old.
Was that the case?
Yeah, back in the old days.
I was drinking my face out 15 years ago. I didn't care about work.
If I do a show next year, I will have been working in television for 50 years.
Wow.
I started, I was 17.
Yeah.
And, you know, back then it was black and white. They had turret lenses on the camera. And you had to push them around. It was, when I think back, it's like a whole other era. But I tell you, the one thing that was different then than exists now, there was a sense that you could make a show and get it out to an audience without nearly as many filters as there are now. You had local television that actually existed. You could do a show. Halifax was sort of the kingpin of that with, you know, Don Messer, Sing Along Jubilee, all sorts of other shows. And they were generated by the local stations, and they aired to huge audiences, embarrassingly huge audiences for the guys in Toronto often. And all I would say is I think the CRTC has a fair amount of, there's blame to be laid at the feet of the CRTC for the way our situation as Canadian TV watchers and TV creators have evolved. I mean, the 1999 decision was a terrible decision, and the CRTC for a long time, my feeling is that it's become kind of more tuned to the problems of the broadcaster than the needs of the people watching shows, or even, I don't think that people who create shows deserve a special consideration, really. It really comes down to, all we want is access. Just give me a crack at reaching an audience with a show that I think will work. I'm quite willing to live with, gee, that sucks. Get that thing off the air. Or, wow, that's terrific. So I think, if we're talking CRTC here, if this is a CRTC, let's talk about television, I would say to the CRTC, you have to think a little bigger than the needs of Rogers, Shaw, CBC, and Bell Media. They can take care of themselves. They have huge amounts of money that they can figure out how to make a buck in the broadcasting market. Netflix doesn't need your help. Amazon doesn't need your help. The audience does. And if obviously this whole discussion has been skewing consumer, meaning what they really want to do is deal with cable packages. I would say to the CRTC again, it's not as simple as cable packages. It's what's on the air and how do you encourage Canadian television to be different? Because that will influence what happens on the internet, what happens on all sorts of, whatever distribution systems there are. So, I think the CRTC has to look at itself, the mistakes it's made in the past, and think seriously about, when you're thinking about the consumer, he or she is not just someone who puts money on the table. He or she has a soul that needs to be nurtured and needs to be entertained. Think about that aspect of it too.
Okay.
And that's my lesson.
Yes,
And as long as there is an exceptional content that could be added, then indeed, I totally agree with you. One of the things that I'd also like to mention is the movement towards internet broadcast. And there is definitely a huge migration. Some of the broadcasters have actually lost revenues in incredible amounts. And I think that it takes a collective effort, not just on the behalf of the CRTC, but as well, public awareness is one of the things that we should discuss at some point. In addition to, excuse me, in addition to our responsibilities as filmmakers and creators, what do we truly want to define through the content that we provide? So
when you refer to migration to the internet, are you're referring to how
consumer behaviors?
Yes,
how primarily. What can
content
people
is consumed?
Indeed.
What does that mean for creators? I mean, because this is the world. Richard, you mentioned it as well. You framed it as opportunity, as more delivery options. As a creator, is that how you're viewing it? And
I would say viewing it from the consumer's point of view, what they can actually afford in this day and age. We're looking at the decimal figure that is what broadcasters can offer versus what internet broadcasters can offer. And I don't think that the content would be very much different. The storytelling and all of the basic narrative, that would still stay and remain the same. But what I think is just adding competitive content that would add more value, that would help the broadcasters in many ways to have these shows on the air, right? We can't ignore the fact of Netflix and Hulu, that they do exist. And just about last year, they have generated a revenue of $690 million.
In Canada.
I would say in the US.
In the US.
Yes, absolutely. And defining that line is very important for us as Canadians. Where do we want to go ahead with a neighboring country that have long been influencing not pretty much of the culture, but of the content that we would produce. So,
Okay, interesting. Anybody else want to comment on? Yes, Michael.
I was just thinking about the future, and I just have to look at the viewing habits of my two kids who are 10 and 13, and they don't watch television at all. I'll force them to watch Netflix with me, or else they'll be on their the computer or their handheld devices. And that's speaking to the customer of the future. That's them, right? They're not going to do the appointment viewing anymore. I just think that's a thing of the past. So, but I don't think that negates the need for a concentration of talent and capital to create cutting-edge programming. I still think in order to guarantee our place at the table, whether it's on Netflix or wherever else, we still need, highly trained creative types, and we need the capital and the technicians to make it happen. The same thing we need for conventional television. So I'm not sure how to regulate Netflix aside from suggesting that a certain percentage of what they offer Canadians is Canadian, and also, obligating them to take a percentage of those huge profits and funnel them into production. I mean, I look at the success of their shows, their original program in the US at the Emmys. I mean, it's proof that, when you get the creator and the consumer as close together as possible, good things happen. So I think as we contemplate how to, regulate Netflix, et cetera, we should think about that as well.
But within a defined territory, well, in this case, it would be
Yeah,
Canada.
yeah, absolutely, within the Canadian territory,
Yeah,
yeah. I guess my point is we still need the industry as it stands now with the supports that the government offers it to keep it in place to create that cutting-edge programming that's going to guarantee eyeballs coming to watch our shows. I'm with Wayne, if the show stinks, take it off the air, but in order to make great shows, you need the people to make them. So, and we need to keep an industry here rather than having a huge brain drain to the US if there is no regulation.
Right. Yeah. Gary?
The other aspect of that is those people, that concentration of folks who work in this industry. My membership, Tim's membership, Richard's membership. This is kind of the core of the creative community within a city like Halifax. And they may make the majority of their living off of television, but they're also contributing to numerous other, commercials and corporate and documentaries. They're in the visual arts, they're in music, they're in, and without that industry, without that concentration, without that income from that very important industry, those people would disperse and we would be a hollowed out creative center. So, it's another aspect of when we talk about, how much the broadcasters are making, how much the producers are making. It's an industry that creates economic and cultural and information activity within the community that houses that industry.
It's not specifically exclusively for television product, it's for a whole range of content creation.
The industry brings those people
Yeah.
together and then they
Maintains the
contribute in a
infrastructure.
myriad of other ways.
Yeah.
And go home and make their own shows on the internet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
So,
the skills
absolutely.
are transportable. It's not exclusive to TV or anything else. We're creating, whatever you want to call it. It's not television anymore. It's, it's
Storytelling.
storytelling. Exactly. It doesn't matter what the delivery mechanism is. The skill set required to deliver a quality product, is already in place. We just have to keep it there.
Yeah, the French word works a lot better, diffusion. It's not broadcasting, it's not internet, it's all of the above. And, whatever it is, whatever 2-minute, 12-minute, 30-minute, 60-minute package of entertainment or factual information you've got, it gets out into the world, it gets diffused through many different ways. I'm not sure, that we need to, if it's a CRTC discussion, I keep coming back to the fact of, we have to, the CRTC needs to look at why it exists. It's there to regulate the radio and television industry. That was its original mandate. And really what that was about was making sure that there was access, that Canadians had access to what was then broadcasting. I think they have to take that thinking and move it into the new world, which says that there's all sorts of different ways to get these shows out there and all sorts of different ways for Canadians to receive them into their lives. Let's just make sure that there's some access for Canadian stories, Canadian game shows, Canadian music shows, whatever, for a Canadian consumer.
Regardless of.
Yeah, no matter how you
Yeah.
get it out there.
Scott, I saw your hand up there.
I think as we go forward, I just wanted to bring up another topic, which is in terms of trade, and perhaps maybe grouping kind of the protection of rights in with that discussion. 'Cause I'm not sure, I do think it is that, we're all a little bit, the next generation is not gonna watch TV. They're gonna watch video, multimedia content on multiple screens. It's not going to be traditional television as we grew up with it. And I'm not sure how you regulate the internet. In fact, I would probably say that most everybody in this room knows exactly how to hide their IP address and watch American Netflix. It's very easy to do. And so I sort of think about, I've often thought about what is a different way to kind of monetize or legislate the monetization of internet content. And we often compare the regulation, television regulation in Canada to what happened in the music industry and how we grew in a music industry based on a quota system. And it's not directly transferable. But the other thing the music industry does well is protect the rights of musicians. Now, they're fighting the same battle when it comes to piracy, and I don't want to talk about piracy. I think that's a whole other discussion. But if you go into a Starbucks and you hear music played over over the speakers, so that artist is there's that facility, in this case, say Starbucks, is paying into SOCAN, which pays out royalties to the artists who own the rights to that music. Whereas if you sit in a Starbucks and you use their Wi-Fi and you watch a TV show, that's not happening to the person who created that TV show. Likewise, and now I know that the cable industry and the internet industry are very much, they're very tied closely together with, Bell and even Eastlink, Rogers, et cetera. But I've always found it interesting that the internet providers don't necessarily have to pay into a, I always thought about, we wondered if there was a way that the internet providers could pay into a kind of pool of money, much like the radio stations do to SOCAN, that could then be distributed to the content creators, which are consumed via that wire or wireless in this case. And that way you're basically saying it's again, it's sort of you're regulating the point of purchase. Which is in some ways the only way you can do it right now with the internet. Because even though I have access to the entire world's worth of content on my wireless device, I still have to connect to something. I have to connect to a satellite, or I have to connect to an internet provider of some kind. So, is there a way the CRTC perhaps may have a role in regulating that at that point? And I think that's probably where the discussion has to go in the future.
At the access point.
The access point, yeah, which has traditionally been, I turn on my television. The broadcasters pay for that show to be produced. The cable provider pays for that show. They charge me as a consumer. I sit there and watch it. And if you look at that model now, which is being broken down now, because now we've got a cell phone or a tablet or a computer, we're still doing the same thing. We're consuming content on that machine. Now it's much, much harder to control that content because we have access to everything everywhere in the world. But I still need to connect somehow. Mm-hmm. And someone is providing me with that connection, and someone is making money off that connection. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's something that I think is worth investigating as an alternative to, I don't know that you can, I mean, I'm not sure if that's the solution or that's an alternative way of regulating, but I do think there's a way. I mean, I'm just trying to make a buck, I want to make TV shows and movies and make and be able to pay my mortgage and feed my children. And we're all too willing. I think that certainly there's a generation that's all too willing to put their stuff on YouTube or up online for free, right? And again, that's happening in the music world as well. But we saw a debate in the music world that I think is apropos to what we're talking about, which is more established artists saying, look, I can't give you my music for free because that's how I make my living. But there's a whole generation of 20-year-olds who are saying, I can, or I will.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've done it too. Like, I've put my stuff up for free, and it's because the pressure is there to do that. Is there a way to? I think it's a little bit of changing the consciousness of the public who are even some of my colleagues are probably downloading television shows for free, for torrents illegally, whatever. I think there's a changing we're required to change our perception of what is ethical consumption. And I think at the same time, I think we have to look at ways of protecting the rights of content creators in a increasingly accessible, online distribution system.
I saw your hand, Laura, but before your point about there's a whole generation that's willing to put their content up for free so people can see it. I think also we can all agree that there's a whole number of people who expect to receive content for free. So that's, sorry, Laura?
No, and my point is much to Scott's as well. I'm coming into this world now. I'm just producing my first shorts, going into my first features and first bit of television. So my world is the world that we're living in. So for me, television doesn't come into part of that. I haven't owned a television for probably 3 years yet. That's the content I want to make, but I do not expect those shows to be seen anywhere but on the internet or in a lot of other ways. And we talked about the broadcasters. So CMF, you apply for the English development program, you need to bring on a broadcaster in order to do that. But part of your application for that is your media, right? Like, you have to have 3 points of transmedia with that, because they do recognize that that is exactly where we're going. That's exactly how you need to be accessing your media, be showing it to people from an audience perspective. So as broadcasters and as the CRTC as well, I think it's important for there to be some sort of regulation that we can talk about and put in effect over a long time, because obviously managing the internet or anything like that is very, very difficult. But I think if we do not start moving that way, I just don't know how any of us will get paid for our work at the end of the day, because people can access it for free, and they will, other than things through like Netflix.
I think Tim was first there, Mike.
Just on a couple of points that Scott raised, I think protection of the rights is certainly something that the Guild is very concerned with, particularly for directors. We are venturing into, with this new agreement that we've just signed, a new set of bio rates for directors across the country, and a new way of looking at things. We're also establishing new rates for web content direction and things along those lines. So it's slow, but we're doing it. There's that question of monetizing the web and how we can justify that, given the short bursts that it's in. It's a slow process, and we're going to be seeing more of that coming through, but it's definitely something that, on the unions and guild side, ACTRA's already gone down that road with its last agreement. We're going down that road. We're going to be seeing more and more of that. I think the other thing that, as a concern, a challenge, is making sure that, and just to the larger conversation about the regionalism and making sure the regional voices are heard. There is certainly a movement in the bigger centers that the work should stay in the bigger centers, and I think part of the CRTC has to maintain strong values for regional production and regional voices to be heard, and those broadcasters hear and see that the regional content is very much important, as it was back in the day when local stations could actually put things on. I think that's very important as well, and I think something that we're going to have to make sure that we maintain the pressure on, so that voices from this region are heard on a national level.
Okay. All the more of a challenge as we enter into this sort of borderless, multi-platform environment. Right? Anybody have any other comments at this point? I would just like to, I'm just going to go back for my own sake, maybe remind us that the CRTC, their mandate, very simply, right, is to create rules and support mechanisms to ensure there's an important place for Canadians within our broadcasting system. So, we've heard that has been critical for success to date. We've heard maybe there needs to be a completely redefined broadcasting. The word broadcasting needs complete redefinition. And we've also heard the word opportunity and different delivery and consumption from consumers. So with that in mind, is there any specific or general thoughts on how the CRTC can support you as creators in this new world to, just as Michael referenced earlier, first comment was how that's been critical in ensuring that we've developed our talent and we're here, we're telling stories. As we go forward, are there any suggestions, ideas, or input in terms of how CRTC can do that? Mark.
Gord, correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't the CRTC already determined that the internet's not within their purview? And so is this really a discussion about some other regulatory body? And as a Canadian, I feel we have a lot of regulation already. Mm-hmm. But isn't this really about somebody else stepping in here to try and figure out how to support producers in the exploitation of content on the internet?
That's not my understanding. It's not specifically about internet. It's just going back to the concept of the television system as we know it, and going forward, how can the CRTC respond to changes, to help support?
The question that comes out of that point is, what is the CRTC interested in dealing with? Is it going to limit itself to the current broadcasting milieu?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
If that's the case, then we can probably all leave because the future is elsewhere.
Yeah.
So if they're going to limit themselves strictly to the radio and television system as it stands, pass out the life jackets, the Titanic's going down.
Well, I think they're looking to. I think the purpose of this is to project down the road, right, with the experience and knowledge that is in this room, and make the suggestions, provide the input to help them deal with the future.
The broadcasters they're dealing with have internet companies on the side, and they have mobile phone companies on the side. So, the people they're trying to regulate are already moving outside regulation. Mm. So, how is that going to work? Is my question.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, well, unless the CRTC sort of is prepared to look at a slightly broader picture, we're stuck with what it is now.
Perhaps that's a suggestion from this group.
From me, it sure is.
Definitely, they have to re-examine the
For the
decision
record.
not to regulate the
ultimately,
internet. I mean, I seem to remember a story, maybe it's apocryphal, that when Netflix moved into Canada, they said, who do we talk to about, because I know you folks have Canadian content regulations. Well, not the CRTC, because we've already decided that we're not going to regulate you. So there was receptivity on the part of Netflix, but there was no reciprocal kind of movement from the CRTC. So I think, as Wayne says, and as my children's behavior sort of dictates, the future is there. So if the CRTC wants to have a future, I think that we all have to move toward that together.
Okay. Mark?
I mean, I think one of the key things we have to be looking at is, like, if we're talking about web broadcasting and the idea of, like, companies that can support this model. We have like a flurry of activity down in the United States, some really incredible companies that are innovating in this way, such as Hulu or Maker Studios or Machinima. And I mean, these are companies that are now doing some really amazing, they're producing some amazing content, and they have their own distribution channels. So the big question for me is, like, why is this not happening in Canada? At least not, like, have we produced a web broadcaster that's really of that same sort of scale? I'm just wondering, is there a way then that the CRTC can encourage that kind of behavior, encourage the emergence of new voices on the broadcast, in the web broadcast spectrum? I'm not sure how to do that exactly, but I think it's important to be asking that question.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Anybody else at this point? That's interesting. So but that content, say that the examples that you just used, that content is from all over.
Yeah, well,
It's,
yes, there's examples of companies. I mean, I think there was Blue Ant Media has been really aggressive at establishing a presence for itself online. And I think that's kind of, at least an example, a Canadian example and they're working with like other web studios like Mondo Media. They have a new program where they're encouraging pilots to be created by Canadians, 3-minute animation pilots. And that to me is like, very exciting to see that kind of activity. But it's still very rare. And yeah, I just think the key thing here is that whether it's through regulation or through some kind of incentive program, the idea of setting up Canadian web broadcasters that can work with Canadian talent and create content that's would be available to Canadians, but also I'm assuming worldwide. I mean, that would be the sort of the whole basis of coming up with some kind of system that works. Yeah, that's the big question for me is how can we try and encourage that kind of competition, that kind of behavior.
It's an interesting idea.
Mm.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments? Questions about that? David?
I don't know, I find it striking the mention that content is much of it is constrained by the need for programs to be unlocked by a broadcaster. That seems to be constraining the creative element in the internet and in the internet realm, and constraining one from getting involved in there. And you have to wonder, isn't there a model more akin to the telefilm model or political systems in which the more support one gets at the box office or the poll, the more of a support can be given to those individuals, and whether that's done through a YouTube type framework where it's quite easy to see what succeeds there in terms of views, if you want to call that success, and thereby trying to open up funding that way based on the success. Because the other just mention I'll make is when Wayne mentioned it, I think frames it so eloquently in terms of saying, we need to look at this from the perspective of the consumer and giving them the opportunity to consume the great Canadian stories that are all around us. That you look at it from that angle, then whether it's broadcast or the internet really doesn't matter. It's how are things getting, or if the kids are online, playing games, how do you get things to them? How do you set up a system focused on enabling stories to get to that audience is key, the way I think it needs to be thought of.
Okay, so that is just so I'm going to try to paraphrase a little bit. So the CRTC, a potential role would be the CRTC to try to shift its focus from regulation on the broadcaster to actually delivery of content, not just in the traditional broadcast world, but across the various platforms that are now delivering content.
Change from a focus on process to a focus on what's the end desired result.
Right, okay. Michael?
Okay. In terms of the CRTC as the guardian of the Broadcast Act, a lot of people have said, the internet's taken over the primacy of how we're viewing our stories. And it's true. The definition of broadcasting really needs a rethink. One thing that doesn't change is that we have part of the CRTC's mandate is to reflect Canadians to Canadians, not to reflect America to Canadians. And we're sleeping with a giant. Every time the giant America twitches, our storytelling twitches, the deciders' view on what we are coming up with switches. And the protections need to be in place. We need to incentivize excellence and originality in Canadian storytelling more from the beginning, from the creator's perspective. One thing that will not change in a million-channel universe is that good stories well told will want to be seen, and we need to find ways to keep creating that. Last thing I want to put on the record is we are moving toward a centralization. A lot of us have done our time in Toronto, done our servitude, paid homage to the big broadcasters there. We used to have a CTV office here. We used to have a portal to Toronto that we only had to go to Robie Street, and we didn't have to pay a pilgrimage there. We used to have a CBC that was actually way more effectual. I know they try hard and they're very nice people there, but essentially to get a series greenlit, you need to go to Toronto. That I would really encourage, in some way, the CRTC can influence a change back. That Canada reflected to Canadians is not just Toronto and Montreal reflected to Canadians. A lot of us choose to live here in the East Coast, and that needs to be rewarded or at least incentivized in some way.
And I'd say that goes double for writers, because a writer has to go every time he wants to get a new show, because all the writers who are sitting around the circle and the table in Toronto, you know,
It used to be called in the old days the $700 cup of coffee, and
Yeah.
now it's the $1,200 cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And you know, again, speaking from vast experience and the scars to show for it, we go through this pendulum a lot that regional is good. Oh no, back to centralization. Whoa, out to regional. Ooh, back to Toronto, which in the CBC is no longer even called Toronto. It's called Canada's largest city. So it just seems to me that, you know, we go through these cycles where let's have centers of excellence, and they'll be in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and then someone wakes up and says, geez, we're missing voices. And hey, isn't it interesting that all the you know, a lot of the successful Canadian shows are actually produced on the East Coast? Hey, let's go out to the East Coast. So, you know, that too shall pass, but in the end, we just have to remind other people to put that back on the table every once in a while.
But one of the things that has changed since that time is the consolidation of those broadcasters.
Oh, for sure.
And you essentially, where you used to have numerous companies that were trying to get on the airwaves, you got like 3 now.
Yeah.
So what do they
And
care about?
And they
them?
have phone companies, and
Yeah.
they have cable systems, and they have a very confused mandate, it seems to me.
Okay, so again, I think there's some good suggestions here that are on the record for the CRTC to look at. Again, back to the creation as creators. If we look at what the CRTC is trying to do, assuming that they're expanding the definition or their preview, or right, the definition of broadcasting. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that we should be sort of digging up here in terms of support mechanisms going forward? Yes. Oh.
I wonder, we're
Lisa.
talking, yes.
Correct.
We're talking about sort of consumer connection and consumer awareness. I wonder if like the average Canadian television watcher, like someone like my mom, for instance, doesn't even probably realize if she's watching Canadian or American content. So she might be watching a great Canadian show and just assume that it's, you know, made in Hollywood or something. So I wonder if there's something as simple as, and I've had this thought with movie theaters as well, like having some sort of like symbol, like maybe in the TV listings next to the show, like a little maple leaf, and then just to bring awareness, because if they're seeing the symbol everywhere, then people might notice if they are not seeing it, and then there might be more demand on like the consumer level to bring it up. Like, for instance, if you're looking through your 200 channels and you don't see anything you like, but you see a little Canadian symbol, you might choose to watch that show. Just be like, okay, well, it's Canadian at least.
Okay.
I would disagree with that. I think that could lead to ghettoization. I think that there's a perception bias amongst the populace against, because of bad television that's been made in the past, that it's Canadian, so therefore it's not going to be very good. However, I also know that my mother, who is very proudly watching Republic of Doyle and enjoying every single moment of it, and is very aware that that is Canadian, and I think that there is a perception of what are Canadian productions, and I think we need to encourage that more. But I don't know by putting a little label on it if that's the way to go.
Okay, Laura?
I think my response to both of those things, and I agree with Lisa a lot in terms of branding, right? We think about this all the time. The French-Canadian market's having no problem. The Quebec-Canadian market is having no problem, and they won't because of their consumerism. But we, as Canadians creating our content, that's how we feel, right? Is, oh, don't put a Canadian flag on that because people are going to think it's wrong. Isn't it our jobs to create the content to change that perception? It's all about changing perceptions, but I think that starts with us. I think that starts with, by the way, did you know this was Canadian and you love it? And I think not, like, purposely not identifying that is almost a very backwards way of going about promoting Canadian content. That's just my opinion.
Okay. Branding, communication. What are, as creators? So, and we won't flog that horse anymore because I'm sure there'll be other ideas that come up. But what about we talked a little bit about the problems, the challenges that you currently face as creators to get your content on television. Projecting forward, does that change? I mean, you've got probably business models or personal objectives in terms of your role in this system. What are some of the problems and challenges that you foresee, knowing what you know in terms of how things are evolving and changing? Michael.
Well, as Gary points out, with vertical integration, it used to be that there wasn't a huge amount of doors to knock on, but they were different channels. But now there are 3, I think, and you get a no a lot faster because you go to one person and they're saying no for the entire conglomerate of channels. And within that family of channels, they're trying to find ways to create one show that they can put here and put here and put here and put here. So there's this homogeneity going on because the CRTC allowed all this vertical integration. I would just say the only way to push back against that is to compel those broadcasters to spend more money developing shows and taking greater risks. I remember there was this golden age of television conversation, and John Doyle started the conversation, well, why aren't we part of that? And there was a suggestion that, speaking for the writing community, that we were somehow being a little bit lazy, and we were not, but I know from my experience, you don't pitch somebody something that they don't want. And right now, I think they've got this warm bath approach, this one-size-fits-all approach to programming. I think they need to be a little more ambitious. They need to be a little more aggressive and more, looking for more of a niche audience. The only way they're going to do that is to have more money to risk, to take chances. The Americans succeed because they take a lot of risk and they have a lot of failure. We shrink our chances when we spend a little bit of money, and we give some shows that maybe don't deserve it 1, 2, or 3 seasons because there's nothing else to put on in their place. There's no replacement. So I think we need to encourage risk. We need to encourage ambition. The only way to do that is to force the broadcasters to give us more time on air and to spend more money on development and production.
And going, just a second, but just projecting forward for you.
Yeah.
Do you see further vertical integration, but what about the proliferation of new channels?
I'm speaking to our situation right now, but I think we all agree that the future lies beyond the broadcast model that I'm talking about, and I think even broadcasters have to recognize, the CRTC has to recognize that they'll only remain relevant as long as they're offering something that people want to see. But cowering under your desk and taking as little risk as possible is not going to lead you into the brave new world of this,
Okay. I see.
Of all of these different delivery mechanisms. So I think I'm just speaking, and I think it's in everybody's best interest, including these, like the Bell Media or whomever. If Bell Media is known for, risky, adventurous programming as opposed to warm bath programming, then they're going to attract more eyeballs to their PDAs and to their, to all of their platforms.
Okay. It's in their best interests. Right?
Yeah.
Well, I think, and to put a positive on this new world, because it is there are many positive things to it. What I was speaking of earlier, if there was some way to get, there's lots of stuff on the internet. Most of it is crap. It's bad. People won't actually watch it for more than a minute. To create quality programming takes a certain amount of capital. We can compete with the world once we make it. That's fine. Once you get it out there, it's the creating it. Well, nobody's going to take more risks than the creators themselves. And I'm not talking about giving, $500,000 to every writer that comes by. But if, little pilots and little shorts were in the hands of the creators to create, then you don't have to fly to Toronto. You put it on the internet and you can get a response. And you can go to a broadcaster and say, I don't care which one of you wants to bid for my show because 1 million people watched it last night. And that's an opportunity that we actually have. If somehow we could take, the funding model and bring it closer to the creators. If I were able to create 5 little pilots a year, I would have 1 hit every 2 years. I would have a whole lot of duds, but I've had shows optioned by broadcasters, and by the time it comes out the other end, I'm just like, is that what I wrote? Maybe, I don't know, because their vested interest is in maintaining the status quo, mimicking the larger market, mellowing down the show. Mine is to get that original creative voice out there, and right now, it's such a struggle just to get there, to get any amount of funding to do anything. It's just, you can give it away for free for a while, but not for long.
I'm seeing a connection with what you're trying to describe and what Mark was describing earlier in terms of an online broadcasting incentive or something that would provide an opportunity for Canadian content to go direct to consumer in a very quick way.
The other interesting thing that's happening with all of this kind of convergence into digital media or whatever is I think that dividing line between television and film is disappearing. And I think, certainly from our point of view, we're seeing the diminishing budgets that are going to, and support that's going to Canadian independent film. And yet, there's Mark back there, produced Blackbird, which just got awards left, right, and center. I think the CRTC should be looking a little more at the other screen-based art forms and a little bit of hands across the water with telefilm and working on, instead of siloing these things, kind of bring them all into one big ball of wax.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that with the internet, because the internet and the television, we're talking about different viewing habits, but slowly what you're seeing is computer monitors getting bigger and better to the point that in 5 years, I'm going to have a 65-inch computer monitor that shows me shows, and they'll be no different than the 65-inch television. And you won't, it'll all be the exact same thing, and the people won't know, like you spoke of not knowing if it's Canadian or American. People aren't going to know if they're watching the internet or traditional broadcast. They're going to press a button and it's coming into their house.
And instead of binge watching 17 episodes of Breaking Bad all at once, they'll watch a really cool, really edgy, really risky Canadian feature film. What difference, you know?
My problem with the internet is it's always buffering.
It's the dial-up.
It makes that weird noise.
You got to move closer to the city. When did you buy your last computer?
It's the dial. That's a good one. Does that still exist, I wonder? Mark?
It's an interesting point because, feature films have been really struggling in this country for years now because of changes that have been put in place, and there's now very, very few places we can go to receive support to produce feature films, and as a result, I think the ones that have that are sort of surviving are the ones that the visions that are actually getting made are ones that are much more sort of directed towards the international marketplace. Certainly they'll have a distinctive sort of Canadian place and setting and characters and what have you, but it's the ones that are going to succeed are the ones that hopefully can work in other marketplaces. And I think that may be a template for a lot of television going forward. Because I think Michael brought up a really good point, and this right now a lot of the broadcasters are playing it very safe. I remember talking to some executive at Shaw. They had just taken over, and of course Global had bought up all these properties, and they were talking about how they were producing something for Showcase. It needed to work on Global too, And part of me is kind of like, I just think that's crazy, like that, you know, like Showcase was meant to produce really edgy programming. It was meant to be something really different, you know, and if it needs to fit on global, then like, I mean, if that was the case 10 years ago, we would never have had Trailer Park Boys. So they would never have taken a leap on that kind of project. So I think it's a real danger here in that complacency. Because we have the money right now because of all the consolidation. The money is like, you know, it is there, but it's going to dry up, and if, you know, because there's they can't keep on consolidating. It's pretty much, I think we've reached the end of this, and so there's going to be less and less money, which means we're going to have to be working with less and less resources, which means then we have to be producing stuff for Canadians, but also for the international market. That can work, and of course we're going to be, you know, facing the situation where people will be consuming their content, you know, there will be almost no boundaries. So that's, I don't know where exactly I'm going with this, but we just have to recognize that there's going to be this brave new world that's going to be coming forward very, very soon, and the CRTC has to be prepared for that.
I wanted to bring it back to the CRTC because you know, if a broadcaster wants to put show X on 2 different channels, I don't know where the CRTC comes in to that. You know, like we have to bring it back to what is the CRTC's role. I don't know how they would. That's an operational.
Definitely more money for the development and production of cutting edge programming.
For different different fresh perspective programming content, which would then be available to the whole. Well, the specific network, the specific channels.
CRTC, when they license the broadcasters, create their mandate.
Right. Okay.
Showcase, what is your mandate? Showcase and Global shouldn't have the same shows.
And how often does the CRTC actually act on people sliding out of their mandates? I think once on the History Channel, they finally got cranky a couple of years ago and said, no, boys, the deal was you're going to do a History Channel. I'd like to see the CRTC doing a lot more of that, and they haven't because, in effect, they've become kind of handmaidens to the industry rather than regulators of the industry.
Okay, thanks. Tim?
They need to allow the creation of things like Starlight that was tried to, you know, that goes the feature film content and what we've been talking about. That's the sort of thing that we need. If they need to allow for that sort of development so that we can have the feature films on the television world, or as it may be, whatever comes into your television or box. But that's a very vital part of it, and I think they need to re-examine that idea. And maybe Starlight wasn't the perfect package, but something along those lines. That's definitely what we need to do. And they also do need to do the regulatory work. You know, CSI on History Channel is not appropriate, or at least make a Canadian scientific investigation or something. You know,
Investigation of the past.
Murdoch's going to end up on the History Channel. You know, I mean,
They were funny hats.
it was in the old days.
Okay. Well, that's great. That's good. Are you finished, Michael, or are you?
No, I just wanted to. I'm just kidding. You can't handle the truth. So yeah, you know what? The stuff I don't think. Sticking to Gary's point, I don't think. Trying to blur the line between a Canadian feature film and a Canadian television series, if that's what you were saying, Gary, but you may not have been, is the right thing. I think. You know, more people watch Canadian feature films on television channels now, but was it ever thus? I mean, we always do that. The feature film industry has huge problems that we probably should stay out of this discussion. Mostly distributor-based, for the record. That's me. Why don't we do an American Horror Story? Why don't we have, this is to Michael Amo's point, and everything Michael's been saying, I mean, Michael's in the front lines of this stuff too, and I know. Why don't we have a Homeland? Why don't we have an American Horror Story, a Mad Men, or a Walking Dead? Because we live in a culture, the networks live in a culture that is risk averse and fear driven. And we should have those shows. We have the talent to create those shows. So, incentivize risk. So let's create a culture that celebrates risk rather than is frightened of our own voices.
But isn't the other issue that we need to do beyond, you know, a Canadian replica of Boardwalk Empire? We need risk. We need our own things. We don't need absolutely. You know, we don't need a Canadian version of Mad Men.
No, we don't. We should
I don't
be
think that's
creating
what
our
he's
own
saying.
shows.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Scott Free's doing the Klondike right now. I mean, that's an American show. Americans doing our history for us.
Seriously,
Yeah.
exactly.
You know, it's
For us.
absurd. It's
Well, it's
absurd.
also the number of Canadians that are down there writing on these
Yeah,
shows.
on Mad Men, for
I
instance,
mean,
among-
it's
yeah, many other
Hollywood
stuff,
is awash with Canadians.
Yeah.
Why are they there? I mean, we have the most talented writers down there, but they
Yeah.
can't make a go of it here or don't want to because of the situation we've created.
Or the weather.
Oh yeah, there's that. Can the CRTC fix the weather? That'd be great. Oh, it's raining.
the Weather Channel.
That's right. Always sunny in Halifax.
So in order to ensure that this risk-taking is embraced by the broadcasters, the CRTC would have to, what?
I think it means, and I've said this 3 times, and I still believe it, I think you have to give control of what's being created, not to a bureaucrat who's trying to keep his job at a network. It has to be a creator who believes in the story they want to tell. I mean, somehow we have to remove it, put it back, the onus on the writers, the creators, the producers, who believe in a story. And they don't need to be going and begging for someone to listen to their story. They need to either get a bit of their story or an opportunity to just do it. And when the real person who cares about the idea is the loudest person in the room and everybody has to listen to them, that's when you're going to get the truly original creative story.
And when do you know somebody will want to watch that wonderful, passionate story?
Well, that goes to the, I don't know. I mean, I don't
That's where
have
you-
all the answers, but
That's
if,
where you're online.
but if there was, Amazon, what Amazon.com did and what we are part of working on, they said we have X amount of money. I don't know what it was. I think it was 10 million bucks they had from selling rowing machines to Gary. They said, we're going to create 10 pilots. And then they created 10 pilots. They're completely different. They're all over the place. They're, they were like, and literally, we need a pilot for girls, a pilot for boys, a pilot for live action, a pilot for crazy people, and just whatever. And they're going to throw them on the internet
And see what.
and see what sticks. And if it sticks, they're going to commission 52 episodes of it, and off it goes. I mean, it's a completely merit-based system where they're just allowing the creator to have the voice and the opportunity and the platform. And then if it doesn't work, 9 of those pilots are dead. So what? Go write your next pilot. That's fine.
And I'll just say, Amazon is well capitalized to do that, which is a great opportunity for those 10 pilots. I mean, that's amazing.
But it also speaks to an entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
Somebody sat down and said, I've got 100 billion or whatever. I'm going to take 10 million and try this.
And
I
can do the money.
Frankly, I can't imagine that happening in the Canadian broadcast environment. I mean, if you go right back to the one thing that's been absolutely consistent in the 50 years that I've been doing this is that, for a private broadcaster in Canada, it's an idiot-proof business. Basically, what you do is get the license, load up on prime time from the States, and fill the rest in with game shows. Or some version of it. It's not that they ever really had to make a business work. They just took someone else's business and licensed it into Canada. And that's, unfortunately, a big part of the Canadian psyche in general. But, we haven't really had what I would call creative entrepreneurial broadcasters in this country. And if the CRTC can do anything, maybe it can remind them that, you're in business, boys and girls, and you're in the Canadian business. So try to find some way to make it a little bit more Canadian.
Okay, thanks. Scott, you've had your hand up.
I think part of the reason why there's a lack of risk-taking is because the stakes. Quite frankly, there's not that much competition because there is only 3 broadcasting conglomerates remaining. So there's not, and what they're competing on is not necessarily Canadian content, but on which American shows they've bought from last year. So if you're each of the national prime time, the broadcasters who are broadcasting, say, drama and prime time, are filling the bare minimum of Canadian content criteria. Like they're filling up their 1 or 2 hours or whatever, and they are getting a lot of their eyeballs because of the American shows that they're broadcasting. So why take a risk on me, or a new voice, or a cutting edge idea, when they don't need to, and perhaps they probably it's not worth it. They've got a lead in from to a successful American show. They might as well go to their friend down the street in whatever central Canadian city they happen to be based in, and buy whatever show or commission whatever show that company or that collaborator is producing, because it's safe, and that might go on the air for a couple of years, and maybe it'll get a few eyeballs, maybe it won't. It's not, the stakes aren't that high, because it doesn't matter, because they've got The Walking Dead, or whatever popular American television program is on that night as well. So they don't live or die necessarily by those choices. And I think the interesting sort of the irony is, I think that it's high risk, high reward business. In a sense, if the broadcasters were willing to take more risks, the reward would be greater. And it's just that the place that they're in now is that they don't do that because they don't need to.
We're closing in on a wrap up, so and hopefully we will wrap up. Richard?
Very quickly to follow that, one thing is, if you're forced as a broadcaster, because what you have is a carrot and a stick. The carrot is, hey, access to all these homes. And the stick is the regulation. But if you're regulated so that you have to have Canadian drama in prime time 3 times a week, right? And therefore you're going to be in competition with shows, the shows you're talking about. You bet, because your revenue is from advertisers, you're going to work your ass off to get the best Canadian drama on TV, right? So it's not simply a question, and it never has been a question, of just having Canadian shows on TV, but regulating when they're available to be seen. Because it doesn't matter if a great show is on 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 in the afternoon. It has to be when people are going to be sitting down with free time to watch it and to get engaged. So I think that's definitely something they can do, is move back and say, okay, Canadian drama, prime time.
So the idea of enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Fatigue, yeah.
Right. I would also like to mention that it's only with great risks comes great rewards. And if there could be some funds that would be allocated towards research and development, then that would substantially shape the quality of the products that we can produce as filmmakers. In many cases, I, as a documentary filmmaker, would have to fund that part of the creative process, which of course may not come as easy. Right. But it does play an important role, just to make sure that we have such funds available for research and development. The film industry in general has been responsive to the social, economical, and political changes. We live in a technological era where it's defined by many parameters, yet the pattern as compared in the neoliberal era has been quite similar. The variables have been, for the most part, quite different. I think that we all need to act quite quickly. The growth and the rate of migration is exponential, and it's happening at a much faster rate. So I would definitely say that it will take a collective effort from all of us, including the federal government, just to ensure that funds are available and no more cuts are being introduced.
Okay. So potential role in support mechanism would be in research and development.
Indeed.
And that's not just, or perhaps you meant strictly on the research and development of content, or the research and development on technology, on how you as a creator can take advantage of the different changes going on in technology.
I would say both. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So I don't have a watch, but I'm assuming. Okay, we have about 12 minutes left. is the.
You're doing good.
We may extend for another hour. But, so Laura.
Just to follow up on Andrew's point about Amazon, saying, okay, well, let's have 10 different shows and let's see what comes out of that. We don't have to do it blindly, though, and the CRT doesn't either, right? We have market studies. We know what kinds of shows are on television. We know horror is huge. We know CSI has 14 different versions. Like, we do have pinpoints we can hit on. So why isn't the incentive, we are looking for these kinds of shows, we are looking for these things, which is the same thing that you have when you go to your broadcaster forum, but at least if it's coming from something like saying, as Canadian content, this is what we want, because these are the things that can actually compete against The Walking Dead, against Mad Men, we stand a bit better. So when we're looking at funding creation, as we should, because everyone's right that it comes from the creator, and the loudest voice has to be the voice that wants the best thing to be shown and loves the story the most. If we are actually choosing the marketplace placement of that, then we will be able to put stories together and launch them in such a way that they are more accessible and that they do better as well, I think.
Okay, thank you. So does anybody want to have some final comments or suggestions? Or is there something that we didn't touch on that you would like to touch on?
I have
Wayne.
a small capsule. I would hope that the CRTC would worry less about the profitability of the networks and worry more about the enrichment of Canadian lives.
Okay.
Exactly. Just want to second that.
Yeah.
Reflecting Canadians to Canadians is not reflecting America to Canada. I would way prefer a more active CRTC that enforces the idea that more Canadian shows will create a greater Canadian audience for those shows. The broadcasters are making plenty of money, but Canada is hurting. Our vision of ourselves is hurting. Canada, like Lisa said, and like you said, I think you're right, but Canada shouldn't be a pejorative. And we can compete with the world, we're just not getting the chance. CRTC can help that.
Okay, great. And just to be clear, what I'm hearing too is that is across the spectrum of delivery platforms. Yet to be determined how, but absolutely.